Conservative Party. Mr. Giovanni, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Geist, thanks for being with us today. I'd like to ask you some questions about digital policy, in particular about some of the legislation that many Canadians have called Justin Trudeau's censorship agenda. Some of the legislation you referred to, C11, C18, for example. The C11 gets misrepresented by Liberals here in Ottawa very often as an attempt to push back on big businesses, big corporations, social media companies, American influence. But you wisely pointed out that in a policy directive, they did make clear that included in Bill C11 is a measure of regulating user-generated content. I'd like for you to elaborate on why that's significant and why Canadians should be concerned about that being included in a Liberal policy directive.
Well, this is deja vu all over again, as I had a chance to peer the committee on that bill. And, I think the core of the bill, it does involve the notion of trying to bring large streaming services into the Canadian broadcasting framework. And we're seeing how some of that plays out before the CRTC now with, I think, some real concerns, frankly, about consumers ultimately paying the price on some of the increased costs. But with respect to the inclusion of user-generated content, the policy directive actually directs the CRTC not to regulate users. And the CRTC has followed that. But throughout the process, there were continual denials that this even existed in the legislation, when I think it was readily apparent to just about everybody that it did. And the concern there was that some of the powers that were vested in the regulator could have an impact on the expression rights of those creators. Noting now that the policy direction says, don't do this, but the legislation at least opened the door to things like elevating through algorithms certain content over other content. And what you had were many digital creators, Canadian digital creators, who made the case that they were finding success online and were deeply concerned that having a regulator step in and have an impact in terms of how their stuff would appear on some of these large platforms could have an impact on their livelihood and what Canadians are able to see.
So the fact that the legislation opened the door, to use your phrasing, for the federal government to regulate user-generated content, what is the significance of that in your view? And also, do you think that the concerns raised during the process about the possibility of that regulation over user-generated content were appropriately weighed in the process of putting this legislation forward?
Well, I should note that the legislation actually initially did not include this, include user content. It was during clause by clause of an earlier iteration of the bill that the bill was changed to remove an exception that had previously excluded it. I think the concerns were real. In fact, once the bill left this committee and left the House and went to the Senate conducted extensive hearings on that same bill and actually proposed an amendment to try to directly address that issue. I thought it was unfortunate that government or the House ultimately rejected that proposed amendment, sent it through as they did, and now have been forced essentially, if they really do want to exclude user content, to put this in a policy direction. So for the moment, the policy direction rules. But a policy direction, of course, doesn't have the same kind of power that legislation does. And I think that's why many had raised this issue. Sometimes we're told there was really nothing to be concerned about, and yet the reality was it was quite clearly there. And there were easy fixes, quite frankly, that I think would have maintained the policy objectives that the government and other groups had, while at the same time ensuring that there were better safeguards about including user content within the scope of the law.
When Canadians see this pattern of legislation that's been put forward by the current government, I think that a lot of the time they're being gaslit by the Liberal government to not be concerned, to sort of downplay what are legitimate concerns about concentration of power in the hands of bureaucracies to control what Canadians can see and hear online and consequently what they can say online. When you see those attempts to sort of say to Canadians, don't worry about it, like don't even raise a red flag, like trust the government, how do you respond to that phenomenon we're observing here in Ottawa?
Well, I suppose that at the end of the day, my concern here, and I mentioned it in my opening, was that I don't think we've taken the expression-related issues seriously enough as part of the digital policy. And I should be clear, this isn't just about C11 and C18. The opposition parties, unlike the government, has been supporting S210, which raises real expression rights as well. So I'm not sure that anybody comes here with fully clean hands about addressing some of those kinds of issues. I wish that all parties would take more seriously some of these issues, and to your point about gaslighting, when there are voices, sometimes voices that aren't the typical people that appear before committee, raising these kinds of concerns, that those concerns are taken more seriously. Because I think there was a sense amongst many that that simply wasn't the case through the process in C11.
Would you say that there is an appropriate amount of concern as you observe this legislation, any one of the four that you mentioned? As you see that legislation before, do you see an appropriate amount of concern over state overreach? Do you think that that's something that needs to be emphasized more?
I think we always need to be cognizant of what it means to have government intervene in this way. I think we are, as you heard in your earlier panel, increasingly appreciating the concern of overreach from platforms as well, and that's part of what we're trying to grapple with here. But sometimes as we venture into some of these newer spaces and these newer kinds of regulation, you often get new voices come forward as well. And there's at times been a bit of a reticence to include some of those kinds of perspectives as part of the discussion, or perhaps even as part of the policy development.
Could you be more specific in terms of the
He
perspectives?
can, but another round.
Okay. Thank you.
Last our 6 minutes. Mr. Shampoo for the block for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Once again, I'd like to thank our witnesses who are with us today. Professor Geist, you piqued my curiosity when you referred to C63. I think we would really enjoy a discussion on that bill because I think it contains good things, but there are also aspects of it that might be looked into. So, but I was surprised about your comments about the bill. So, should we just scrap it altogether? Should it go back to the drawing board? But in C63, there's something that's striking for me. There is a section that allows people to report others on the sole suspicion that they could be about to say something hateful or do something. What do you think is the element that led to the insertion of a section of that caliber in that bill? Okay,
thanks for that. First, I want to preface by making clear when I said legislation needs to be going back to the drawing board, I was actually referring to Bill S210, which is the age verification bill that includes the blocking that I referred to and a number of other issues. C63 needs to go to committee. And I think that it's really in some ways two bills in one. There is the element that is the larger part of online harms, which deals specifically with the responsibility of the internet platforms. And I think there's a lot that can be worked with there. I have some concerns about the enforcement mechanisms that have been established, but I think there's a lot that's there. What you are referring to, though, sorry, quickly, my apologies, is the criminal code provisions, and in particular an attempt to create essentially the equivalent of a peace bond for speech in this context. Now, we use these kinds of things in other contexts, right? If we're concerned about domestic violence, we might, and it's imminent, we might get an order to ensure that that doesn't happen or try to prevent that from taking place. This would be similarly an attempt to prevent certain kinds of potentially hate from taking place. If, you know, as I mentioned off the top, Jewish community has seen an unprecedented number of shootings and targets at synagogues and at schools. If we knew that that was coming, then a bond might be able to try to stop some of those kinds of activities from taking place. I think, though, and Professor Laidlaw mentioned this before, both the Criminal Code and the Human Rights Act provisions that are in the legislation run the risk of overreach, and frankly, the bill should be split, and we should be focusing on the internet stuff and leave this other stuff for a separate study.
On est d'accord là-dessus. Merci. J'ai sûrement une autre question pour vous.
We do agree on that. I have another question on C63, but I also would like to turn to Ms. Faure. You talked about journalism and the current climate that applies to journalism, traditional journalism, if you wish, because it used to be that They were bound by certain principles and rules as per the profession, but now we are seeing that journalism is being transformed and drastically. There's militant journalism, younger journalists, for instance, graduating school these days, they are a lot more engaged and they want to take part in a more engaged type of journalism. And they do that in ways that line up with their values and engagement criteria, if you will. So is that a risk for the profession of journalism, or are we able to protect traditional journalism? You refer to Radio-Canada CBC, that plays an essential role in terms of coverage. So what do you think about the new tendencies, new trends? Well, regardless of the type of journalism, I think the essential point is transparency in all of this. We have to clearly state our allegiances because if you have a journalism that engages in the apology of something or something else, because that is in line with their values that are known, that's one thing. But otherwise, if you're a journalist, you should be responsible and you should be open to being held accountable in terms of what you produce and put out. So that's true. Those are facts. But is it journalism at that point? If someone is declaring openly a position, is it still considered journalism, or is it just commentary? What do you think? Because it's this trend that confuses people, because people think, okay, it's journalism, but it's also one person's opinion. But journalism needs to be neutral and objective. So what do you think about that? Well, I'll go back to the idea of transparency. So journalism, if you hold the mic to everyone and everyone can provide their opinion, but if you ask someone, they will provide you their opinion. And in a newsroom, when I used to work in newsrooms, we would have information coming in only reflecting on one aspect of a situation, and then we would mark it as opinion, as editorial, because it's not neutral or it's not objective. So journalism needs to concentrate on the facts, and they need to hold the mic out to everyone. That's part of the journalist's role. Last week there was the FPGQ Congress, and there was a workshop that I found very interesting. It had to do with criminal proceedings against investigative journalists. So is this a new phenomenon? Do you see something concerning in that? No, I don't think it's something new. It's been a very long time that I've been working in this field. There we have always had proceedings, criminal proceedings or otherwise, against journalists when their work made people unhappy. Sometimes people try to find ways in which they try to muzzle us. So it's not new at all. But we have to do that investigative journalism work. The public broadcaster is very important in this sense because it's expensive, it takes time, and it takes a lot of human resource. I have colleagues who spend months working on one file, for instance, so it takes a lot of depth.